It's the late 1960s. You're with your wife, and you're on a bit of a holiday. You've booked a room in a nice hotel looking for some peace and quiet, and after a pleasant day, you've turned in for the night. Suddenly, there's banging on the wall. It gets louder and louder and louder, and finally, the wall breaks. And out of the dust, you see an axe chopping away. There's a pause, and after the dust settles, you see someone peering at you from the next room. "Excuse me," says the face. "I understand that you have a mini bar in your room. May I have a rummage in it? I find myself in need of more alcohol." First of all, there's no mini bar in your room. And second, who is this madman who insisted on coming through the wall instead of politely knocking on your door? Or better yet, why didn't he just call room service? But there is no reasoning with this, Loon, because you have just been introduced to Keith Moon, the drummer for The Who. He was just at the beginning of building a reputation as the craziest man in the history of rock. Keith would spend the next 10 years building on this reputation, which would see more incidents like this, and worse. In fact, before it was all over, he would be responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage, injuries to himself and his bandmates, and at least one death. I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 62 of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And this is the life and crazy times of Keith Moon. I will begin with this statement. Keith Moon was the most depraved rock star of all time. And I know that's a bold statement because there's a lot of competition, but I do stand by it. Yes, Ozzy Osbourne was a madman, but at least he lived until his mid-70s. Keith was so crazy that he couldn't make it past the age of 32. And in those 3 decades, he was eccentric, crazy, occasionally harmful, and extremely self-destructive, while also being one of the greatest drummers of all time. How much of his legendary mayhem is true? Well, put it this way, enough to cement his well-earned nickname, Moon the Loon. Keith was born in the Wembley area of London. He was a hyperactive kid and would today probably be diagnosed as having a severe form of ADHD. Not surprisingly, he was terrible in school. When he failed some exams, his teacher wrote this: "Retarded artistically, idiotic in other respects." But he did concede that Keith did have potential, but he was too interested in always showing off. Too many practical jokes. He must have been fun in science class too, because Keith loved to make things blow up. His parents soon learned that he shouldn't be trusted with the home chemistry sets that were popular back then. I've heard him described as a real-life Bart Simpson. When he was 12, Keith joined the Sea Cadets and was given a bugle, but he found that too boring, so he decided on the drums, probably because it was something he could hit. By 14, he dropped out of school and was learning how to repair radios, and this gave him enough money to buy his first drum kit. This was one area where Keith had laser focused. He practiced constantly and even took drum lessons at London's first ever drums-only store, a place called Drum City. He studied records by Elvis Presley and the Beach Boys and many other hits from the early 1960s. His first band was called the Escorts. In late 1962, at the age of 16, he moved to the Beachcombers, who played covers. And this is where his theatrics began to manifest themselves. One thing he did during gigs was shoot the lead singer with a starter pistol. Then came April 1964. He went to a gig by The Who, claiming that he was a better drummer than their current guy. Keith, just 16 and maybe 5'8", somehow managed to convince the group to let him sub in for the second set of the night. He proved himself right, but not before destroying the former guy's drum kit in the process, wrecking the drum pedal and putting sticks through the heads of at least 2 drums. Quick aside, that's a myth. It never happened that way. However, this kind of thing is going to come up a lot in this story. But the truth is that Keith managed to wrangle his way into a Who rehearsal where he tried out and won the job. He was asked to join the band, but only on the condition that he quit his day job at a gypsum company. Keith didn't need to be asked twice. Another aside, Keith liked to say that he went through 21 different jobs in a year. That is not true. It's just another example of how he liked to exaggerate. When he became a full-time professional musician with The Who, he'd had his job at British Gypsum for about 18 months. The Who wasn't the most peaceful of environments. Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey often fought, sometimes with fists, and Keith did not make things calmer. Roger did not like Keith, and the feeling was mutual. He also got into fights with the quiet and soft-spoken bass player John Entwistle, largely because Keith's style of drumming wasn't exactly conventional, which could become annoying to the other half of the rhythm section. Keith played drums like they were the lead instrument, and he didn't play them as someone too concerned about keeping time for the rest of the band. He'd also speed up and slow down in songs, depending on his mood and his mental state. And then, of course, there were all the practical jokes, and not all of them appreciated. The man was a comic menace and could be exhausting. He never stopped. But one thing is for sure, Keith's drumming changed everything about the style and sound of The Who. It took a while to get used to the things Moon did behind the kit, but when they locked in, wow. In August 1964, The Who were playing a show at the Railway Tavern in London. The stage was high and the ceiling was low, and at one point, Pete bashed the neck of his guitar into the ceiling, ruining it. In frustration, he trashed the rest of the guitar. Keith loved this and soon joined in by wrecking his kit. And this became a tradition that cost about $300 in destroyed drums each time. That's over $3,000 in today's money. Keith did not have an off switch. He was always going, always partying, always pranking people. At one point in 1966, he thought about leaving The Who to form a group with John Entwistle and Jimmy Page of the Yardbirds. But when he floated that idea, he remarked that it not only went over like a lead balloon, but like a Led Zeppelin. When Page did move on his new group, he remembered what Keith had said, and, well, you know what happened next. Keith was often bored on the road, so he made his own fun. He found pleasure in wrecking things in his own home. Friends often witnessed Moon wrecking their furniture. A favorite thing was to throw stuff out of a window, and the higher the floor, the better. Pete Townsend says the first time Keith wrecked a hotel room was in Berlin in 1966. There's an undated story. Could be true, maybe it's not. There's the exaggeration thing again. But it goes like this. Moon was picked up at his hotel in a limo. Halfway to the airport, he told the driver, "I'm dreadfully sorry, but I forgot something. Can you take me back to the hotel?" When they arrived, Keith ran inside, went back up to his room, and threw the TV out of the window. When he got back into the car, he said, "Thank you. I nearly forgot." By one estimate, Keith's destruction of hotel rooms over his lifetime cost somewhere around $500,000, and in today's money, that's between $2.5 and $3 million. By the time The Who was touring the US in early 1967, they were playing 2 or 3 shows a day. At the end of each gig, Keith would kick over his kit. This tour included an appearance on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour on September 17th. Keith thought that this should be an explosive performance. I mean, literally. So he bribed a roadie to stuff one of his bass drums with gunpowder and then ordered him to set it off at the end of The Who's performance of My Generation. But there was a mix-up. Depending on who you ask, the roadie used between twice and 10 times the amount of gunpowder that was necessary. And then at the end of The Who's customary smashing of the instruments, the explosion was so big, it knocked Keith right off his drum riser and saw some shrapnel of a destroyed cymbal lodged in his arm. Meanwhile, Pete, who had no idea this was coming, suffered permanent damage to the hearing in his right ear. By this time, Keith was an enthusiastic drinker and consumer of drugs. Amphetamines made him even more hyper. He also got into a super strong hallucinogenic from San Francisco called STP, but his trips were so bad that he gave it up. It was even enough for him to stop smoking for 4 years. When asked about his ambitions for a magazine article, Keith replied, "To smash 100 drum kits and to live forever." This for a drummer on a song with the line, "I hope I die before I get old." He played so hard that at the Monterey Festival in June 1967, he gave himself a hernia during the band's set. Okay, that's not entirely true either. He was mad at the audience for not being enthusiastic enough. The hernia happened when he picked up part of his drum kit and threw it hard into the audience. I have told the following stories before on an episode called Times When the Rock and Roll Party Went Too Far, but if we're going to be complete, they need to be recounted here. On the same tour that had The Who at Monterey, Keith bought a piranha fish in Vancouver. He then took the fish on the road, staying in hotel bathtubs until one night the water got too cold and the fish died. So he just wrapped it in toilet paper and left it on the toilet seat for the maid. He bought a movie camera, which he used to capture life on the road, often while he was completely naked. Hotel hallways got flooded when Keith turned on fire hoses and then put them back in their cabinets. In Alabama, he learned of a highly explosive firecracker called a cherry bomb, so he stocked up on those. In Birmingham, he used a couple to blow up a suitcase and a hotel chair. And then he tried to flush one down the toilet. And when that didn't work, the toilet was destroyed and a hole was blown in the floor. Keith said that was punishment for poor room service. Cherry bombs, also known as M80s, got boring after a while. And that's when Keith moved to actual sticks of dynamite. In a bio on Moon, his friend Tony Fletcher says, no toilet in a hotel or changing room was safe until Keith finally ran out of explosives. Lots and lots and lots of toilets met their end this way. There's the story of Keith running away from some mobsters by jumping off a pier in Atlantic City, New Jersey. That doesn't appear to be true. Keith was just off his nut and had to be rescued from the sea by a roadie. And did Keith drive a car into a swimming pool at the Holiday Inn in Flint, Michigan on August 21st, 1967? Well, that's the legend. And yes, there was a big birthday party for Keith at the Holiday Inn that descended into a big food fight with some cake and with Keith running around without pants and falling hard enough to break a tooth. But the incident with the car, said to be a Lincoln Continental, did not happen. Nor was the Who Forever band from every Holiday Inn after that. It's a great story. Again, not true, but it did make for some great publicity. And with each passing month and year, the story was accepted as gospel. There are, however, plenty of true stories. Some of those when we get back. On this episode of Uncharted, we're trying to document the life and crazy times of Who drummer Keith Moon. Many stories are swathed in myth and legend and are probably apocryphal, but others are 100% true. One thing that needs to be emphasized is that Keith's appetite for destruction rarely involved any kind of anger or malice. They were mostly pranks, although control wasn't something that crossed his mind. Sometimes he was sober, sometimes he was not. But the legal consequences and the monetary damages were very, very real. Keith drank a lot. Brandy and champagne were his jams. He often drank so much that he passed out in the middle of a conversation or in the middle of a meal. He'd even sometimes drop off in mid-sentence. He often went to bed drunk and would immediately begin drinking the moment he got up. To counteract that, he took speed, various amphetamines, and a lot of them. When he needed to sleep, he used any number of barbiturates. Cocaine was always there for recreational fun, and Keith also availed himself to various prescription medicines, especially sedatives. By his own admission, he often had no idea what he was taking, and he had zero regard when it came to drug interactions. There were bar fights, arrests for disorderly conduct, arrests for property damage, and arrests for public intoxication. And the entire time, he was supported and bailed out by his wife, Kim. On April 4th, 1968, The Who were on tour in America again, and they were staying at the Gorham Hotel in New York City. Police were called to a disturbance. Moon was out on the ledge of his 9th floor hotel room, throwing his beloved cherry bombs at everyone in the street, including the cops. This was after he'd blown up another toilet and ruined the plumbing. He was very drunk and had to be carefully coaxed inside so he wouldn't fall to his death. The Who were kicked out of the Gorham and tried to check into another hotel. They were refused. Then they tried another, refused again. So that's 3 hotel ejections in one day. Later that year, Keith was driven in a Bentley to a gig in Glasgow. As a joke, he bought a pair of blow-up legs, a set of women's stockings, and a pair of high-heeled shoes. Going through town, he stuck the fake legs out of the car windows and made noises that sounded like a woman being assaulted. At the gig, police turned up, responding to a complaint that someone had engaged in a very public rape. Keith got a big laugh out of that one. By 1970, Keith was smoking heavily again and eating a lot of bad food. He put on weight, and the rest of the band could be assured that when he showed up for a gig, he would be drunk. Miraculously, though, he managed to play his way through almost every show because he somehow sweated it all out. Notice that I said almost every show. We'll come back to that. First, though, we have to discuss something that forever changed Keith's life. It happened on January 4th, 1970. A new dance club called the Cranbourne Rooms opened adjacent to the Red Lions pub in a London satellite town of Hatfield. This was about 15 kilometers from Keith's house. Keith, of course, loved to go out, and although he had no business attending the opening of this club, it was not his scene at all. He went anyway. Keith, his wife Kim, and another couple piled into Keith's Bentley. The driver, as always, was the faithful Neil Boland, who also functioned as Keith's unofficial bodyguard. When these long-haired rockers exited the car, they realized that the Cranbourne Rooms and the Red Lion were domains of skinheads, and they did not take kindly to rich people with long hair and unkempt clothes. These skinheads were of the racist type too. They were football hooligans, prone to the old ultraviolence, and there were about 200 of them at the opening of the Cranbourne Rooms. At first, Keith didn't seem to notice. He was convinced that his charm and wit could win over anyone, and besides, the Who came from mod culture, which was at least part of the skinhead world, so no problem, right? Well, it turns out that the Skins definitely had a problem with Keith and his entourage. The closer it got to closing time, the more obvious it was that there was going to be a fight. Two of Keith's friends saw it coming and went to wait in the Bentley. Keith, meanwhile, always the last to leave a party, insisted on staying until closing time. Then somewhere around 10:30, he and a skinhead started exchanging insults. There was definitely going to be a fight, so Keith and his wife did the smart thing and left. But they were followed by about 30 skinheads. When they got to the car, it was pelted with coins, and the Skins surrounded the car and started shaking it. Neil Boland was behind the wheel. An experienced bodyguard would have perhaps eased the car ahead slowly on the way to an escape. But for some reason, Boland got out of the Bentley and moved around front to physically clear a path through the skinheads. He was out there on his own despite everyone in the car yelling at him to stay inside. He managed to get away from the initial swarm, but then suddenly the Bentley shot forward about 30 feet. Keith was behind the wheel, trying to drive away. He kept going at around 10 miles an hour, trying to get to the main road. Before he got there, though, he and everyone else in the car noticed the screaming from the crowd outside. But Keith didn't stop. About 100 meters down the road, a van pulled up alongside. "Stop!" said the driver. "There's someone under your car." It was Neil Boland. When Keith hit the accelerator, he knocked over Boland, who was out front trying to clear the way, and he was pulled under the car and dragged for 100 or maybe 150 meters. Keith jumped out, looked under the Bentley, and saw Boland's head crushed. There was gray matter everywhere. Police were called and arrived within minutes. Because the Bentley was too heavy for even 10 men to lift, the fire department had to jack up the car to get at Neil. But it was far, far too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival at hospital. Moon was given a breathalyzer and found to be way over the limit. Did he have a driver's license? No. Did he have insurance? No. Two people were arrested, an 18-year-old and a 15-year-old. They were charged with causing the disturbance that led to Boland's death. A total of 8 people would be charged and eventually let off with fines. Meanwhile, Keith admitted to being behind the wheel. There were 3 other people in the car who confirmed that. But Keith was never charged with anything. An inquest was held 6 weeks later and cleared him, except for the charges of driving under the influence, driving without a license, and driving without insurance. He pleaded guilty to all of them. No fine. He was absolved of all responsibility in Boland's death. He did, though, know he was at fault. He was devastated at having killed his employee and friend. That guilt would stay with him for the rest of his life, and it resulted in horrific nightmares. He'd jolt awake saying, "I have no right to be alive." All the drinking and drugs and partying and pranking turned from being for fun into an escape from the personal hell Keith had created for himself that night. So it only got worse, much worse. Keith Moon started with amphetamine sometime around 1965. By the 1970s, he was a full-blown addict and alcoholic. The thing that kept him relatively sane was the routine of being on the road. At the end of each crazy day, he did, after all, have to play a gig. And because he played with such physicality, touring kept him in shape. It wasn't much structure, but it was something. But when The Who went on a nearly year-long hiatus, starting in December 1971, that structure disappeared. Keith was left to his own devices, which was a very bad thing. He passed the time by partying harder than ever. He didn't even have a drum kit set up at his house so he could practice. His routine became wake up, start drinking, take some speed to keep drinking, and then keep drinking. Friends say he went from being a fun drunk to someone to be avoided at all costs. Keith would take any drug offered to him. There were several occasions when he reacted badly and had to be taken to the hospital where he had his stomach pumped. There was a big scare in early 1973 when he visited Leslie West and Corky Lang from the band Mountain, who were recording in London. That night, Keith hoovered up a lethal amount of heroin. He probably thought he was just doing a line of cocaine. He was rushed to the hospital and given the adrenaline needle to the heart. It was later determined that he'd consumed a series of downers along with a lot of alcohol. He definitely nearly died that night. But it didn't slow him down. To Keith, just another fun adventure. Keith obviously was suffering from some kind of mental illness beyond drug addiction and alcoholism. In hindsight, he was probably afflicted with borderline personality disorder, which can have people walking a tightrope strung between neurosis and psychosis. Symptoms include impulsiveness, self-damage, periods of disassociation, fears of abandonment, and an inability to maintain close relationships. Did he receive treatment? No. This was the 1970s, and a big rock star could never admit to needing this kind of help. However, by this time, Kim, his longtime partner, could not take it anymore. She took their daughter and filed for divorce. Friends believe Keith never really recovered from that. In fact, it got real bad. Keith allegedly made threatening phone calls to Kim, and then about 18 months later, he invited Kim's new husband, Ian McLagan, the keyboard player for the Rolling Stones, to a pub for a drink. And that's when some baddies broke into their house looking to do something. Allegedly, break all of McLagan's fingers for 250 pounds. When Pete Townshend accidentally found out, he paid this same baddie 250 pounds not to break McLagan's fingers. When it came time to tour behind the Quadrophenia album in 1973, Keith was completely out of control. The worst came on November 20th, 1973, when the band played in front of 14,000 people at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. Keith arrived with a young woman on his arm. He was nervous, but that wasn't unusual. Keith always got amped up before gigs. And this was the first show in America in some time, so he was extra nervous. "Here, dear," said the woman, "take this. It'll help you calm down." Keith, being Keith, accepted. He thought this was Mandrax or some other prescription sedative. But it wasn't. We actually don't know what he took. It was mostly likely PCP chased with brandy. But whatever it was powerful enough to knock out a champion drug taker. Then it was time to hit the stage. From the beginning of the set, Keith's playing was off. He was erratic. Meanwhile, his young female friend, who was watching the show from backstage and had also taken whatever she'd given Keith, went into a seizure and had to be taken by ambulance to the hospital. 20 minutes after that, The Who was roaring through Won't Get Fooled Again when Keith just stopped playing. Here's where he should have come in with a series of 3 big drum fills. But there's no Keith. At this point, he'd fallen backwards on his drum throne. He was so out of it that he had to be dragged off stage, and The Who had no choice but to finish the song without him. Pete Townshend didn't know what to do next. "We're just going to revive our drummer by punching him in the stomach," he told the crowd. "He's out cold. I think he's gone and eaten something that he shouldn't have eaten." The roadies were able to wake Keith up. A doctor was called. But Keith insisted on finishing the set, and after 20 minutes, he crawled up to his drums. A roadie gave him a cortisone shot into his bad ankle, and he started playing Magic Bus. And he got through it. Barely. And then he passed out again. This time, he would not return. He had to be carried off stage. Did The Who abandon the gig? Well, that wasn't an option. The show must go on. Leonard Skinner was the opening act that night, and drummer Artemis Pyle was asked if he could sub in, but he didn't know the songs and politely declined. Then Pete turned to the audience. "Does anyone know if there's a drummer in the house?" He was joking, but suddenly a 19-year-old named Scott Halpin appeared at the foot of the stage. "I'll do it," he said. And before he knew it, he was on stage, given a shot of brandy, placed behind Keith's drums, and played 3 songs over the next 30 minutes. There's a record of that. Here's The Who with Scott Halpin playing a Howlin' Wolf song. And then it was over. Scott's payment for the gig was all he could eat and drink backstage. Scott went on to a career before dying of a brain tumor in 2008. Pete Townsend sent a letter of condolence that was read out at his funeral. Now let's go back to Keith. The destruction of hotel rooms continued. After a particularly interesting round of vandalism led by Keith at the Bonaventure Hotel in Montreal, the band and a dozen other members of the crew were thrown in jail. They stayed there until the following afternoon, and they were only let out when the promoter found $6,000 in bail money. His boozing and drugging continued to be out of control. He was so frivolous with his money that for the entire 1975 tour, his take-home pay was £47. That's about $900 today for a whole tour. Now, he did have a driveway full of exotic cars, even though he couldn't drive. And he did, though, get a chance to host the BBC's radio version of Top Gear for a couple of shows in the summer of 1973. There were attempts at rehab. In 1975, Keith was seeing a Swedish model named Annette Walter Lax, who convinced their neighbor in Malibu, California, actor Larry Hagman, to get Keith into some kind of facility. He did, but when the doctor saw exactly what kind of an addict and alcoholic Moon was, champagne, brandy, and speed for breakfast, they declared that there was no hope. A personal assistant, hired by The Who's management to keep Keith sane, quit and begged to be allowed to come back to England from California, where Keith had been wreaking havoc for a couple of years, or he, the assistant, said he would die. Keith would continue to have his on-stage issues. When The Who went on their Who by Numbers tour in early 1976, Keith passed out 2 songs into the very first gig at the Boston Garden on March the 9th. That show had to be postponed and rescheduled. Officially, the band maintained that it was a particularly bad bout of flu. Keith, however, was nervous again before the show and took a handful of downers. The next day, there appeared to have been a serious attempted self-harm. When someone went to his hotel room to check on Keith, they found blood everywhere and a giant gash in Keith's foot. A tourniquet was applied and a doctor called. Had Keith not been found, he would have bled to death. There was another crisis on August the 10th in Miami. Even though The Who was probably at their peak when it came to live performances, Keith barely made it through the show. By the time the final song faded out, Keith was delirious, and he had to spend 8 days in a local hospital. Would he be able to finish the tour? He did, but not before a wild swing through Canada. In Edmonton, he hired 6 hookers, just so he could have a pillow fight with them before the show. The last gig was at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto on October the 21st. This would be Keith's last proper concert appearance with The Who. Afterwards, he had his own little party with a couple of local girls and a big bag of cocaine. The band took another break that lasted until 1978. During this time, Keith kept up with his drugging and boozing ways and also gained a lot of weight. He was admitted to hospital at least once after suffering some kind of spontaneous seizure, probably because he impulsively tried to quit drugs and alcohol cold turkey. But then he went back to his usual ways. Everyone agreed that Keith was now completely and utterly out of control. Another thing that affected him badly was the death of Elvis Presley on August 16, 1977. Elvis was one of Keith's heroes. How could he possibly be dead? The news weighed heavily on Keith, and you can guess how he dealt with that. Lots of alcohol and plenty of pills. When he tried to quit again, he had another seizure. There was another stint in a rehab clinic in London, and a near-fatal overdose of Valium. The very last time Keith performed in public was on December 15, 1977, for an invitation-only gig in front of fans. And that was almost it for Keith. At the same time, The Who had begun to record the Who Are You album. The sessions wrapped up in April 1978. It was released on August the 18th. Behind the scenes, Pete Townsend said that he would not tour behind the record until Keith cleaned up. If he didn't, he'd be fired. And that seemed to have scared Keith enough to behave for a little while. On May 25, 1978, The Who performed Won't Get Fooled Again at Shepperton Studios in London. If you've seen the documentary The Kids Are All Right, that's what we see at the end of the film. What we don't see is how much cocaine Keith snorted between takes. In the middle of 1978, Keith moved into an apartment at 9 Curzon Place in the Mayfair area of London. He rented it from singer Harry Nilsson. He had flat number 12. This was the same apartment where Mama Cass Elliot of the Mamas and Papas died in 1975. The Who Are You album had been released a few weeks earlier. The cover features Keith sitting in a chair with the command "not to be taken away" stenciled on it. And then, during a radio interview, the DJ remarked at how healthy Keith looked. His reply? "Yes, surprising, since I keep hearing how close I am to death." But he wasn't healthy. Keith would binge, go clean, and then have another seizure. This happened with regularity through the summer of 1978. And this is when he met Dr. Jeffrey Diamond. He saw what was going on. Dr. Diamond prescribed a drug called hemineverin, a powerful sedative designed to help people with alcohol withdrawal symptoms. Keith eagerly accepted. He was afraid of being committed to a psychiatric hospital and wanted to detox at home. However, hemineverin is not recommended for unsupervised use. It could be addictive. It could lead to increased alcohol tolerance, and if mixed with alcohol, it could kill you. Dr. Diamond prescribed a bottle of 100 pills with instructions to take one whenever Keith felt the urge to drink, and he was never, ever supposed to have more than 3 a day. But the drug made Keith sluggish. During one recording session, he couldn't even hold a drumstick. On September 6th, he went to a preview of the movie The Buddy Holly Story with Paul McCartney. That was followed by dinner. Then Keith and his girlfriend Annette returned to the Curzon Place flat where he watched The Abominable Dr. Phibes, a cheesy Vincent Price horror film. He fell asleep in the living room and Annette went to bed. This was at about 4 a.m. At 7:30, he woke Annette, asking her to make him something to eat. She whipped up a steak. When he finished, he almost immediately fell asleep in the bedroom. But before he did, Keith took a bunch of hemineverin tablets. A lot of them. Annette moved from the bedroom to the couch because Keith was snoring so loudly. At around 3:40 that afternoon, she went in to check on him. Keith was in bed, lying on his stomach, and very, very dead. It was September 8th, 1978. Keith Moon was just 32 years old. The autopsy revealed that he'd taken 32 hemineverin pills that morning. 6 had been digested, and another 26 were still in his stomach. The drug completely suppressed his nervous system, and his body just forgot to keep breathing. Keith was cremated on September the 13th, and today there's a plaque in his memory at the Golders Green Crematorium in London that reads, "Keith Moon, Who drummer, 1946 to 1978. There is no substitute." The Who carried on, of course. Pete Townsend would struggle with his own drug and alcohol addictions, but survived. Roger Daltrey remained fit. But John Entwistle died in room 658 of the Hard Rock Hotel in Las Vegas, one day before The Who was supposed to start an American tour. It was June 27, 2002. He'd spent the night with a local stripper after having gone on a cocaine binge. The official cause of death was a heart attack brought on by cocaine and cardiovascular disease. There were 3 undiagnosed blocked arteries that desperately needed surgery. This is the result of decades of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. As for Keith, he's still remembered as one of the greatest, most innovative, and most influential drummers of all time. He's also remembered as a maniac, a lunatic, and like I said at the beginning, probably the most self-destructive character in the history of rock. If it ever came down to a battle between Keith and Ozzy, I think I know who would win. There are dozens of Uncharted podcasts available for download. Go ahead and grab them all wherever you get your podcasts. There's my other show too, The Ongoing History of New Music. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes available. I'm always updating my website at ajournalofmusicalthings.com. It comes with a free daily newsletter that I think you'll find useful. And if you ever feel the need to reach me about anything, drop an email to alan@alancross.ca. Technical production for Uncharted, Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry is by Rob Johnston. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Talk to you next time. I'm Alan Cross.